Our SABC News correspondent Kate Fisher joins us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil with the latest update on the G20 Summit. Kate, a very good afternoon to you. So this is a big and important time for South Africa, no doubt, ahead of its G20 presidency. But before we talk about that, I just want to touch on some highlights. I mean, there's been high hopes that this year the G20 leaders would announce breakthrough climate initiatives, especially from a finance point of view. Just talk to us about the highlights so far.
Yeah, that was one of the big goals of this summit, particularly as COP29 is happening simultaneously, which is fairly rare. And there is this stalemate in Azerbaijan at the moment with climate finance experts, negotiators not managing to find consensus. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres calling on leaders here in Rio to try to break that stalemate. After all, they are the ones holding the purse strings. But so far, we haven't seen that breakthrough. An announcement, a statement last night from the leaders suggested that they hadn't managed to find consensus on this, something that will disappoint the United Nations and those negotiators in Azerbaijan. There is still time this morning for discussions. The statement was a very kind of broad one. There was no specifics about how climate change should be, the money needed for climate change, combating it, how that should happen, who should pay what. The only thing we are being told is that the world somehow needs to find around $1 trillion a year, but there have been no specifics that have come out of this meeting so far. So that will be very concerning to those negotiators in Azerbaijan and certainly the United Nations Secretary General.
Now, as South Africa, of course, is set to unveil its G20 presidency program, President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, very concerned when he was revealing that 700 million people are in poverty, with 60% of sub-Saharan Africa affected. I mean, what lies ahead then for South Africa, essentially the African continent?
Yeah, that was a huge number, really startling statistic that he, made sure he said in front of all of those world leaders, the richest in the world. And he is essentially going to take the hopes of the global south, of the developing world, into the next presidency of the G20. In a matter of hours, South Africa will take that mantle. And he essentially has said that he is going to continue the theme of social inclusion that the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, has been trying to work on. His big announcement yesterday was the launch of the Alliance Against Global Hunger and Poverty, which has already got more than 80 nations and international institutions signed onto it. And that is something that South Africa will continue to try to help the global south, developing nations, to reform multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to make them work better for the people who need the help the most, and essentially create a more integrated social safety net. Those are the things that Cyril Ramaphosa says he wants to continue. That began with India, who had the G20 before Brazil, then Brazil, and now South Africa, a kind of continuation of that message of really helping the world's most vulnerable people. Before, of course, after South Africa's presidency, it moves on to the US when President-elect Donald Trump will be in charge.
And very quickly, Kate, let's talk about Ukraine and Russia. The war in Ukraine, of course, dominated discussions at that G20 summit a day after the United States, of course, gave Kyiv the green light, essentially, to strike Russia territory with these American-supplied long-range missiles.
That's right. The war in Ukraine has been another source of contention among these leaders, with the US really pushing and calling on its fellow countries to do more to support Ukraine, and Joe Biden making that announcement that the Ukrainians could now use these long-range American missiles, kind of increasing Ukraine's firepower at the same time as President of China Xi Jinping is calling on a de-escalation in these kind of in this situation, and turning a blind eye as North Korea supplies troops to Russia to fight Ukrainians, whereas the US has condemned that and will no doubt have wished for a stronger message in the communique on Ukraine. But there was no mention of North Korean troops being used by Russia, and they called for a ceasefire in the joint statement, but there weren't any specifics, and it certainly didn't go as far as condemning Russia, which is something that the US would like to see. So there really are some diplomatic tensions over this conflict. And of course, once again, Donald Trump has a very different view of this from Joe Biden, and he will be in the Oval Office come January the 20th, and it's likely that he's already said that he's going to end the war in Ukraine on day one. So even if things are decided here in Rio, it's hard to know whether they will last come a change of power in America in January.